Going beyond the headlines. Asking the questions you want answered. Exploring government policies and how they impact you. We are delving deeper.
Good evening and welcome to Delving Deeper. I am your host, Ayana Carter. Joining me this evening is economist Dr. Dave Seerattan. Dr. Seerattan, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much.
Now, last Wednesday, the Minister of Finance presented his mid-year review of the national budget. Can you share with us your thoughts on what he said?
The main thing in the mid-year review basically was an additional allocation to meet VAT refunds, which has been a thorny issue for some time. So to finally clear up those arrears, especially for small and micro enterprises, you know, that's a very important thing in terms of the survival of these businesses as well as their ability to grow and do those kinds of things. As I was telling someone earlier, you know, the minister mentioned a benchmark about $250,000 for a small and a micro enterprise. That is a significant amount in terms of their liquidity needs and so on. So it's a very important development in the small and micro enterprise sector.
Dr. Seerattan, VAT refunds not exceeding $250,000 are expected to be paid in cash for businesses over the next 2 months. In your opinion, is this a realistic goal, and what impact does this payment of VAT have on these businesses?
Well, as small businesses especially will tell you, you know, the fact that you're not getting your VAT refund on time has an impact on the liquidity needs of your business and your cash flow. So in that context, you know, these are challenges additional challenges that you would place on these businesses. Of course, over the last 2-3 years, the businesses have gotten accustomed to dealing with that, because if you're a business and you realize your VAT refund is coming late, you make adjustments probably with your bankers and so on. But that might be a slightly more expensive option than you would if you got your VAT refund on time. So I think in terms of the financial management of the Ministry of Finance generally, this is a good sign that, you know, the cash flow situation with in the Ministry of Finance is better. The minister mentioned that the overdraft facility is at times have been close to 99%, which means that, you know, the government couldn't tap into the central bank resources at those points in time when it was close to the 100, because there's a limit, right? But now I think he mentioned the figure about 35%, which means that a lot of the funding for the for the payment of these arrears actually could come from the overdraft facility at the central bank. And he did mention as well, if need be, that the government will go out and borrow to meet the commitments that they have. I think also the arrangement where you're paying the larger refunds via these bonds that they have, which is paying about 3.15%, I think, which is reasonable in the current context. So the government as well, using the mechanism of the bond, is to a certain extent also managing its liquidity. Because if you talk to people in the Ministry of Finance who are in budget, you know, sometimes when the finances of the country are stressed, it's a very stressful place to work, because every day you have to check what your cash flow balances are to know whether you'll be able to meet your ongoing commitments. When the end of the month comes and you need to pay public servants, you know, there's a whole issue and thing. I mean, this is not the first time the country have gone through this. I remember distinctly in the late 80s. I basically was a student at university, but I had friends and family who worked in the Ministry of Finance, and they would tell you how stressed things were in terms of the government marshalling its forces to gather enough liquidity to meet its monthly commitments and so on. So I don't think a lot of people realize the way in which the Ministry of Finance functions, and the country might have a lot of resources in terms of reserves and so on, but in terms of the cash needs, the cash flow requirements on a day-to-day basis, that is something that could be challenging at time, because of course the inflows and the outflows is not neatly matched, even for the government, right? And so this whole thing about the VAT refunds and so on goes to the heart of liquidity management for the government, but it also has a flip side in terms of liquidity management of businesses and so on who receive these VAT refunds and so on. And in the context of small and micro enterprises, $250,000 is a lot of money.
And for businesses owed $250,000 and more, we mentioned the VAT bonds, the issuance of VAT bonds.
Of bonds, yes.
Yes. Could you just explain in maybe some simpler terms exactly what are VAT bonds and how does that work?
Well, the VAT bond is like any other bond. The bond is a simpler, an instrument that promises to pay a certain amount at a maturity date with a particular interest rate, a premium for basically the person who is to receive the inflows afterwards, waiting for a 3-year or 4-year or 5-year period, right? Of course, the people who receive those bonds, they could go on the secondary market and sell it to a commercial bank or another financial institution. They, of course, wouldn't get if the bond value is, let's say, an arbitrary figure, $100,000, and you want to cash in now rather than 3 years down the road. You, of course, have to take a little hit, a discount, probably about 97% of the value of the thing to get your money now. But the important thing is that if you wait for the maturity period of the bond, you are going to be compensated appropriately, right? So there are some people who could afford to wait, and they will wait and receive the amount of the refund plus the premium. And those who can't afford to wait will simply cash in and receive a slightly small amount, right? But in terms of the time value of money, some people might decide it makes sense to cash in the bond now. And of course, there are mechanisms in place in the financial sector for that to happen, right? This has precedent. I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember, but in the 1980s, when government had a commitment to public servants and so on, a lot of them were paid in bonds, right? And so it's a promise to pay the amount that you are owed. And if you wait for that period to allow the government to manage its financial resources and so on, you are paid a premium. And of course, if you don't want to wait, you have the option of cashing in now but taking a discount. But it's essentially, I think, is a novel way of the government managing its liquidity needs over a longer period rather than having to pay a big lump sum over the course of 2 months, which, as we already discussed, might create some difficulties for the government cash management and so on.
Are you able to break down for us the IMF's Article 4 report 2023, and do you see economic growth by the end of 2023?
You have to understand that if you have been reading the Article 4 consultation for Trinidad and Tobago every year, as I have been, you realize it should have been obvious to everybody that the Trinidad and Tobago economy, like most other economies in the Caribbean and further afield, would have gone through this V-shaped recovery after COVID. So everybody knew that it was going to take a big hit in 2020 with COVID-19, and then you're going to recover in 2021, 2022. Of course, that general kind of trend would have had slight differences depending on idiosyncratic factors in different countries that had specific problems and so on. But by and large, everybody expected growth to be better in 2021 and to 2022, and to basically get to a point where it was around the pre-pandemic average, historical average, and then moderate over time, right? So the Trinidad and Tobago economy, as other economies in the Caribbean, have done exactly that. So I expected growth to be better in 2021 and slightly better in 2023 because remember, the recovery is a process and it wouldn't happen 1 year, right? Because remember, the pandemic was an unprecedented, to say, people don't realize how unprecedented the times that we are living in. To say, we had a once-in-a-generation financial crisis in 2007. We had CL Financial in 2009. We had the European debt crisis from 2009 basically to about 2012. And just about that period when economies all over the world were starting to recover fully from the international financial crisis, COVID, COVID-19 struck. And then as we were beginning to emerge from that, the Russian-Ukraine war, which sent commodity markets into frenzy and so on. So people have to understand when we are discussing economic performance that this is an unprecedented period in our history. And we are going to face, we have and are likely to face challenges that we haven't seen before. And therefore, in that context, you have to be relatively cautious about about what you do and your economic strategy moving forward. So for example, the overall gist of the Article 4 consultation, to break it down, is simply that yes, things are better, economic growth is better, all the other indicators on the fiscal side, on the debt side, on the financial sector side are looking better because the economy is improving. But because the international economy is so fraught and there are so many downside risks related to, for example, financial weakness in the US, but you know, I've noticed all these banks that recently needed rescue by the Federal Reserve, in the context of what could potentially happen in commodity markets based on the geopolitical tensions that we see, all those kinds of things means that all the improvements we have seen over the last 2 years, 2 to 3 years, so 2021, 2022, and the first part of 2020, the first quarter of 2023, could turn on a dime because there are these risks out there in the international economy that we have to be cognizant of. So although we are seeing things that are better, we have to be very, very strategic in terms of how we pitch policy and so on. So for example, the minister cannot go out and start spending money as if there's no tomorrow and those kinds of things, right? So you have to be very, very strategic. Although there's need to kind of prime the economy, especially on the infrastructural side, which we could probably talk a little bit about, you have to be careful in terms of how the other expenditure components are managed, and you have to always keep an eye on expenditure efficiency, ensuring that you get value for money. That is something that all governments in the Caribbean have had to pay attention to because, of course, resources are now much more scarce. And so you have to make every dollar that you have available to you count, and therefore in that context, expenditure efficiency has to be a high priority of the government. And if you are familiar with some of the literature on expenditure efficiency, the Caribbean and Trinidad in particular have not been particularly efficient in the use of public monies, especially on the infrastructural side. So I'm very heartened to see the finalization of the procurement legislation and so on. That will go a long way to ensuring that everybody who manages public resources in the public sector pay particular attention to following procurement guidelines, but also ensuring that you put the money, that taxpayers' money, to the best use for their benefits.
Now, one of the issues that you flagged, Dr. Seerattan, is the issue of pension payments, national insurance. Could you expand a little about that?
Well, as you would probably have heard in some of the financial press, you know, populations all over the world are aging. And by aging, I mean the proportion of people who are 60 plus relative to the other age groups are higher, relatively higher in almost every country. And that is simply because we have better medical care, people are more concerned about their health, and so on and so forth, and therefore people are living much longer. And therefore the parameters on which our pension system was predicated, such as, for example, the retirement age of 60, has to be revisited because people are living way longer than 60. And therefore, if you have someone on the pension rolls for 25 odd years, and you so you have to pay pension payments for longer, you also have a situation where the proportion of the people over 60 is increasing relative to other age groups. You have basically less and less people who are working to support more and more of these people who are retired and need assistance, income assistance through the pension and so on. So if you don't revisit the parameters of the pension system, such as the pension age and the contribution rates for these pension systems, then we are going to run into problems in the future. So, with pension system, you don't wait until you have a problem to deal with the thing, because by then it's too late. right? So most actuarial reviews of the pension system in Trinidad and Tobago have concluded that we not only need to increase the retirement age, but we also need to increase the proportion of contributions that everyone pays to backstop the solvency of the pension scheme. Because I think, don't hold me to this, but the number and the year mentioned in the article for consultation, I think is 2030, when the pension system, there might be flashpoints emerging in the pension system, and 2030 is basically right around the corner. So if you want to implement changes that could backstop and strengthen and bolster the pension system, you need to do it basically now, right? To get it up to a situation where when people retire 5-10 years from now, they have no issues about the safety of their pensions and so on. And this is not only in terms of the public pension system, right? And we have a pay-as-you-go system, so it's not funded, right? The private sector pension system are funded. So that means that every month you contribute a certain amount of your salary that goes into this institution-wide fund, and that is used, those funds plus returns are used to fund your retirement. In the public system, in both the, in the public service, it's not like that. We basically pay pension benefits from recurrent expenditure, and therefore that has implications for the overall fiscal situation that the government finds itself in. So if your pension liabilities are set to increase drastically, and your contributions and the amount of earnings from the pension system is not high enough to meet those things, then the government has to step in basically and pay more and more money. And that, of course, has implications for the overall fiscal balance and the current balance on the fiscal account, which is something that if that gets out of control, the things that happen is that debt starts to go up, right? So you have to keep your control of these kinds of things. And in the case of pension systems, you cannot wait until there are red flags emerging everywhere in the pension system to do something about it. Because again, to do something about it requires legislative changes. And we know that legislative changes in Trinidad and Tobago do not necessarily happen as quickly as they should. And therefore, there are lags in terms of the government, any government being able to implement the necessary changes to ensure the solvency of the pension system. And therefore, if you know that the pension system is probably going to start experiencing some pressure around 2030, you need to start now about doing something about it.
Now, Dr. Seerattan, if you had to rate Trinidad and Tobago's economy on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the strongest, what rating would you give it? Well,
it's funny that you ask that. You know, I tend to be more generous with my student when I'm graded, right? So my grade and somebody else's grade might be slightly different, but I think I would probably give the Minister of Finance about a 7, and only 7 because there are lots of things we need to do on the supply side to really get the economy humming along, because a lot of the problems we face, whether it's pension system, whether it is welfare levels in terms of real incomes and so on, in terms of poverty, in terms of ensuring that, you know, we could pay a reasonable wage to everyone up and down the salary scale and so on, the only real long-term solution to that is higher growth, right? And therefore, in the situation that we found ourselves, probably around 2013, 2014, and after 2009 when CL Financial thing, was that we had a situation where the economy was out of whack. It was unbalanced. And therefore, normally when you have a situation like that, we went through something similar to that in the late 80s. And what you have to do, there's a period when you have to stabilize and just make sure that everything is relatively stable. And once you have that, you have a platform on which to be much more aggressive in terms of pursuing policies that could drive growth. So I think we had reached that point probably about 2018, and all things being equal, the government probably should have started driving more policies on the supply side. But of course, COVID-19 came and interrupted all that, and you have to forget all of those plans and simply focus on getting us through the pandemic, right? So now that has passed, fingers crossed that the Russia-Ukraine war doesn't escalate out of control, and and the markets have really priced in that particular event, and you're not going to see major volatility in the commodity markets because of that. Once that is so, now we have a platform on which we can launch policies that is going to make growth much more robust. So for developing countries, growth about 3% and above is good. Some people have argued that in developing countries who have a much smaller base, you probably need a growth rate about 5%. But if you look at the history of the Caribbean and Trinidad and Tobago in particular, there are very, very few times where we actually hit 5%. Even in the heyday, I think there are 1 or 2 occasions on which we hit growth above 5%, right? But that is not the norm. So I think anything between 3 and 5% would be in the future, consistently in the future, is what we need to backstop all the wonderful things we have in terms of our social and national development goals and so on. We had to start talking a little bit more about the future rather than what we have done in the past. This country has a penchant for the blame game and what you could have done and so on and so forth. That helps no one. You understand? We have to focus. We are in this position now. We have to focus on what is the requirement moving forward. And given that we are still in a very fraught international economic environment, you cannot put all caution to the wind and simply go and do what you need to do. But I mean to say, this thing that the IMF talked about in terms of the pension system, this thing that we have been talking almost until we are blue in the face about, which is diversification, we have to start now, because you can't wait until the IMF mentioned the whole maturing of the energy sector. 10 years down the road, the energy sector is still going to be our mainstay. But the fact that we want to have diversification is in recognition of the fact that every time the price of oil or gas turns south, we don't have to be scrambling at shores to sustain our economy and so on, right? So you want to have a certain level of resilience. Even if the economy recovers and the energy sector gets back to growing at a very robust pace, for resilience and for ensuring that we have a relatively stable growth trajectory going forward, you need to invest in diversification efforts. And I mean to say, when you look at some of the documents that have been produced in the public arena, they talk about the export agriculture, they talk about tourism, they talk about medical tourism, they talk about the marine industry, bridge building and so on. They talk about the services sector, both in the energy industry and so on. But I mean to say, small economies are undiversified for a reason. It's not because they deliberately choose to be undiversified. Small economies have binding constraints in terms of resource endowments, in terms of financial resources, in terms of intellectual and skill resources, and in terms of the industrial capacity of the country. So you cannot diversify in every single sector that you think you have a chance. You have to focus on 1 or 2 things and try to do them well. And to me, the tourism sector is the low-hanging fruit. The Caribbean already have a brand out there in the international arena for tourism. What requires now is serious investment in the infrastructure, things like what the government is seeking to do with the development of the Tobago airport. You need to put in place infrastructure for cruise tourism. I mean to say, it's madness not to have cruise tourism now in Tobago. Well, I shouldn't say not have cruise tourism in Tobago. The infrastructure needs to be upgraded to be in line with the Barbados and the Bahamas and so on and so forth. Recently the Bahamas government redeveloped their cruise tourism infrastructure completely, right? So it is, the last time I went to the Bahamas, I remember distinctly the berth for the cruise tourism having 2. Now I believe they have about 6, right? And these are the guys, if you want to get into the tourism industry in a safe way, these are the guys you have to compete with. So for example, we have to invest in things in event tourism. So we already have the carnival in February, right? I think that what the THA is doing in terms of seeking to have their carnival in October, right? So it is not, you don't have a sharp increase one period and everything just dies down, and hotel occupancy rates drops from 80% to zero. You can't, that's not a viable economic model for the thing. So, and you look at tourism arrival numbers, a huge proportion of the overall number for the year actually comes in that period, right? So, yeah, these things are not rocket science, you know. It's just the will and the determination to do it now rather than later. Wait until the energy sector have matured completely and growth in that sector cannot drive the kind of growth we want to see in the economy, right? So you need to, again, just like the pension system, you need to do things now so that those things are in place when the inevitable decline comes. We need to rebalance the economy and so on. And these are some of the things that the IMF Article 4 mentioned, but in the discussions that have happened so far, you know, these important things are not getting a lot of play because people are concerned about whether this number was right in the short term and so on. And those things are important. But when you read through the report and you summarize and you really try to kind of pick out what are the important things, is those long-term kinds of things that they mentioned about the pension system and about rebalancing the economy to depend less. Not that we're going to completely do away, we can't do away with the energy sector, right? But in terms of the proportion that the energy sector contributes, that is important to ensure that growth is between that 3 and 5%, and also because you want your economy to be more resilient. You don't want it in a deep trough one day and in a boom the next day, right? That is not the kind of dynamic you want in your economy because that incentivizes a certain kind of behavior, which is inimical to long-term development. And the thing about the pension system, the IMF also mentioned that we have high replacement rates and the lowest contributions, which means that our people have a very strong, a stronger pension system than many people in the Caribbean, and you want to maintain that level in the future. But the only way you could maintain that level and make it so that our pensioners have a reasonable standard of living is to make the hard decisions now to backstop the solvency of the pension scheme 5 years down the road.
For yet another year, the budget will be in deficit. So what must happen if Trinidad and Tobago's annual revenue exceeds its expenditure?
Well, if it exceeds the expenditure, that's great. I suppose the minister will put some in the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. The remnants could possibly go to boost up our reserves. But again, that's one of the strong suits of people who realize that together with the Heritage and Stabilization Fund and the reserves at the central bank, you know, we have a level of reserves that is much higher than our counterparts in the region and so on. So again, you know, it could be higher. I'm one of the person that said during the boom years we should have been saving more, right? But it makes no sense looking back in the past. We have a situation now where we have X amount of US dollars, which is more than adequate given the problems that we have. It is always better to have more, but it makes no sense crying over spilt milk what we could have done differently 10 years ago. This is what we have now, and we have to focus on the future in terms of not only shoring up the reserves, but in doing things that the economy generally, because remember what reserves are and what the Heritage and Stabilization Fund is a kind of emergency funds for when things go bad, right? But if you prevent things from going bad by judicious policies and so on, you don't really have to tap into those reserves, right? So, in many ways, good policies are a kind of a substitute for reserves.
Now, earlier you mentioned Guyana, and Guyana is projected to be one of the fastest growing economies for 2022-2026. What measures would need to be taken for Trinidad and Tobago to be recognized as one of the fastest growing economies in the world?
For the first thing, if you could get another, if you could organize a next oil boom or gas boom, that would be great. We will be flying, right? But you have to understand that Trinidad and Tobago is a much more mature economy than Guyana. I mentioned the fact that Guyana has a much smaller base to what Trinidad and Tobago is, right? And therefore, even if we were to have a similar level of inflow as Guyana, the mathematics of it would mean that we would not be growing at 64% because we're coming from a much larger base, all right? So the things that could get us, I am not looking for a boom because, you know, there are problems related to boom because there are all kind of expectations that happen in booms in terms of income levels, in terms of inflation, in terms of wastage, in terms of corruption, that are not necessarily good things for development. The IMF and other people have pointed out that countries that are commodity producers that have these huge booms are notorious for bad governance, right? Because money is flowing like water. They don't need to be prudent. The kinds of incentive structures you have in the political system predispose it to people becoming clients of the state and to corruption. I think if we could grow at between 3 and 5% over the medium to long term, that is quite adequate to meet our development goals. Anything above that, then the only thing it will be prudent for the government to simply save those surpluses in Heritage and Stabilization Fund. But for the requirements in terms of the medium term, I think 3 to 5% is going to be quite adequate to ensure that we can meet our development goals. Because at the end of the day, I always point out to my colleagues, sometimes we get so enmeshed in looking at the trees, we don't see the forest. And I always tell them, all these things we're talking about in terms of adequate level of reserves, in terms of low inflation, in terms of high growth, these things are not ends in themselves. They are means to an end. And there are many countries who have relatively high levels of growth. But when you look at poverty levels, when you look at overall welfare levels, where you look at poverty and so on, it is obvious that somehow the growth is not making a dent in these are the important things. Because the reason we want higher growth, the reason we want low inflation, the reason we want higher employment is so that people could have a better standard of living, right? And we want to be able to, as a society, to achieve our development goals. So I think focusing on growth only is a mistake. Growth is important because that allows us to do a whole series of things. But if we have only high growth and we don't make the necessary changes to ensure that people far and wide in the country or in the urban centers, in the young and the old, benefit from the high growth, then what is it all for? Right? So you have to look at a wider set of metrics to assess whether the country is going forward, standing still, or going backward. And when you look at that broader range of metrics, you know, although we have suffered a little bit since the end of the commodity super cycle in 2014, when we compare ourselves to other countries that have been going through similar things, we have not done too badly. We could have done better, but as I said before, it makes no sense looking to the past. We have to focus on what is going to take us forward to this brighter future.
And just one final question, Dr. Seerattan. If you were in charge of Trinidad and Tobago's purse, what is one thing that you would do immediately to change the economy, turn things around, or to improve the economy?
Well, I would do some of the things that has already been done. I would invest a lot of money in the infrastructure in Tobago, especially in terms of the airport, in terms of the port infrastructure for tourism. In Trinidad and Tobago, our public infrastructure has deteriorated significantly in the last 3 years. So we need to spend a lot of money on that front. And that alone, research has shown that when you do these things to improve the transport network in particular, that is one of the best things you can do to incentivize growth and business activity in those areas that were previously cut off from the urban centers and so on. So the road networks, the bridge networks, the port, and so on, these are important things that the government could do. Now, the government can't do it alone, right? So the private sector has a large role to play, but because the private sector and the state sector is so connected, people don't understand when they talk about government reducing its footprint. The government in small states like ours always have a relatively higher footprint, larger footprint in the state. If the government cuts back too much, the private sector is also going to suffer because people don't understand. There is no mutually exclusive zone between the government and the private sector. An economy is like a living organism, where one part influences what happens on the other part. And I also tell people that the economy is made up of a number of different satellites. So there's a satellite economy in Point Lisas. There is a satellite economy in Tobago. There are different growth poles in the economy that we have to pay attention to. So if, for example, in the southern thing, when petroleum shut down, that was created a vacuum. Now that the entity, the surviving entity is kind of building back up itself and so on. But when you take out major growth pools from the economy, you have to seek to find ways to replace them, right? And is in that context, you have to think about the economy as this living organism that is interconnected, and you can't tinker with one side without affecting all the other areas and so on. And in that context, I don't envy central bank governors and ministers of finance who have to manage this situation in the current environment. When things are going great, it's easy. But I mean to say, I know a number of the different governors, central bank governors around the region, and that now, in this current environment, is one of the most stressful jobs you could have because they are responsible for managing in this very fraught environment. And you always have to make a judgment about performance by contextualizing where you are.
Do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think when you are talking about economic policy, you are fighting for heart and minds because you cannot get the political and the political consensus required to go in a particular direction if people are pulling in so many different directions. And I think the public discourse on where the economy needs to go and so on have to happen in an environment where people not only discuss the statistics, but have an honest assessment of the context in which we are operating, so that, we have a certain minimum level of consensus, because without that, we are not going to get very far because, if you have one administration doing something and the minute another administration comes in, they come in and go in a completely different direction, then the economy generally, the society is taking 2 steps forward and 1 step backward, right? So that level of consensus that needs to happen in terms of the public discourse, and the press is very important. The press is very important because no matter what although social media is now the thing driving a lot of narrative in the public and in terms of public discourse, the press, the traditional press, is still very important because they still wield significant power in terms of people's views and opinions and so on. And if you have a very important role to play in that consensus building and figuring out what is the best route to take for the country, because there are multiple ways of dealing with our problems, but of course there are only a few ways that are actually going to get us to where we want to go, right? And in that respect, the kind of almost confusion in terms of the public discourse on this issue about economic development and performance and so on, it is holding us back in terms of really making a huge leap forward in terms of the things that we need to do.
Well, that's our show. Thank you, Dr. Seerattan, for joining us on this week's episode of Delving Deeper.
It was my pleasure.
And join us this same time next week for another episode of Delving Deeper. And just before we go, we cannot leave without saying Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers of Trinidad and Tobago. I am your host, Ayana Carter, and from all of us here, have a good night.